Flamine the Guide. We are the Breakfast Club. We got a special guest in the building.
That's right, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League.
Jonathan Greenblatt, welcome.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for having me.
How are you, man?
I'm well. How are you guys?
Yeah, blessed, black, and highly favored.
Doing pretty good.
There you go.
So let's start off. What is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League?
Well,
What do you do?
What do I do? So the Anti-Defamation League, let's just step back. It's the oldest anti-hate organization in the United States. It was founded in 1913 after a Jewish man was lynched. He'd been falsely accused of a crime, wrongly convicted, and ultimately the mob tore him from his jail and they hung him from a tree. And while the corpse was still hanging from the rope, they all gathered around, the town did. They had a barbecue underneath the body. They took pictures and they turned the photographs into postcards.
Sounds familiar.
I was going to say, like, lynchings happen to young black men and black women very frequently in the South.
In light of the recent campaign by Keith Woods and others to try and ban the Anti-Defamation League and draw attention to the extremely antagonistic and sinister influence of the organisation, I have decided to throw my hat into the ring and offer my perspective on the organisation as someone who is educated in the legal profession. For those of you who don't know who the ADL are, it's hard to say just how massively influential they are in shaping online and political discourse. The ADL have for some time now catalogued various terms, phrases, words, symbols and events under what they deem as hateful and slander any associated with these as racist, anti-Semitic and dangerous. This has been a problem for Western civilization as of late because the ADL do not just serve as some sort of anti-Semitic watchdog looking out for Jewish interests. They're also extremely proactive in organising boycotts against those they deem hateful by attacking and putting pressure on the sponsors of their enemies. You don't need to look any further than the recent campaigns against Elon Musk's Twitter, Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. For anyone doubting their influence, you just need to see how Elon Musk, just after purchasing Twitter for the stated goal of upholding free speech, was reduced into paying them lip service just days after taking over the platform. The ADL is notorious for its anti-European stance and numerous contradictions, namely listing people's anger and sadness over the spate of murders against white farmers in South Africa as racist, including the term "it's okay to be white" as a hate slogan, and for going against Tucker Carlson for mentioning the Great Replacement, however also stating at the same time that Israel should not subvert its national identity by giving Arab citizenship. It's a sad and frustrating sign of our times, how such a hate-driven and tyrannical organisation can actually be upheld as some sort of virtuous organisation fighting hate. It's also very interesting that the ADL is not a non-profit organisation and also makes a huge revenue of $80 million per year. The ADL, formerly known as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, is a non-governmental organisation based in the United States that specialises in civil rights law and combats anti-Semitism and extremism. It was founded in late September 1913 by the Independent Order of B'nai B'rith, a Jewish service organisation in the wake of the contentious murder of Leo Frank. The ADL subsequently split from B'nai B'rith and continued as an independent US section. Its current CEO is Jonathan Greenblatt. And that is going to be the topic of my video today, diving into the origin of this evil organisation which was founded in defence of Leo Frank, who was convicted of the rape and murder of Mary Phagan in 1913. As I have received an extensive education in law and have read hundreds of case notes, evidence reports and witness statements, I feel I can bring a decent level of research to educate others on this case, in a bid to prevent the ADL from rewriting history in this case and robbing justice from Mary Phagan. To say something quite cliched, this is a video I really didn't want to make and was quite hesitant to do so. It's a lot easier on my conscience and safer just to make the usual downfall of ex-YouTuber videos, rag on Ethan Klein some more. Most of all, I didn't want to misrepresent the facts of the case and talk about something that I didn't fully understand or do proper research in a bid to make a political point against the ADL. That's not who I am, and most of all I think it would be doing the memory of Mary Phagan a great disservice by stating that her killer was someone who would be convenient for my argument and not who it really was. However, the more and more I read into and research about Mary's murder, it wasn't just apparent that Leo Frank was the killer with an overwhelming amount of evidence to pin him as such, but the fact that many news outlets today, as well as the ADL, try and actually subvert justice by protesting Frank's innocence, that is just some white supremacist conspiracy theory, is a shocking and disgraceful indictment on them. What immediately rang alarm bells for me was that I firstly decided to look into what the defenders of Frank had to say. The entire first page of Google presents various articles revising the history of this case, alleging that there was some sort of neo-Nazi conspiracy behind claiming the murder was perpetuated by Frank. But to anyone with the slightest bit of critical thinking, these articles immediately get blown away. I'll link this article by the Washington Post, for example, if you want to read it and just see how weak and substanceless the modern defense of Frank is. I'll also link the ADL's brochure on the case, which is also extremely weak. The brochure has little information about the trial itself and does not dive into the evidence, testimonies with any real depth, Instead, the bulk of the brochure just looks at anti-Semitism during this time in general. One interesting thing I do briefly want to mention is a fascinating and convenient misrepresentation by the ADL's brochure and the Washington Post article, namely that they allege the verdict and subsequent lynching of Frank was the product of anti-Semitism due to Frank being Jewish. They also try and cast doubt on the validity of the trial by stating that there was an all-white jury, trying to imply that the jury was racist and had it out for Frank, a Jewish man, completely failing to mention that 4 members of the jury were in fact Jewish, who voted for a guilty verdict. Therefore, what I've noticed is that for the sake of their thesis, they ignore Frank's white skin and use his ethnicity to make their point. However, on the other hand, they ignore the Jewish ethnicity of 4 of the jurors and instead focus on them having white skin in order to characterize the jury as all white and therefore anti-Semitic towards Frank. The ADL's defense of Frank relies on 3 main points, all of which I'll debunk in this video. 1. The supposed rampant anti-Semitism at the time that motivated the people of Georgia to persecute Leo Frank. 2. The evidence to tie other suspects to the crime, such as the bloody shirt found at Newt Lee's residence. And 3. The subsequent affidavit of Alonzo Mann that came out years later in support of Frank, revising his previous statement. The people that were in proximity to Mary and her place of employment during the time of her murder were as follows. Leo Frank. Frank was the man who was ultimately convicted of the murder and rape of Mary Phagan. Frank was the factory superintendent employed at the National Pencil Company at the time of Mary's death. Frank was born into a Jewish American family and moved to Georgia in 1908, where he involved himself with the city's Jewish community, also being elected as the president of the Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rith, a Jewish fraternal organization. B'nai B'rith's stated goal is the commitment to security and continuity of the Jewish people and the State of Israel. As head of that branch of the National Pencil Company, Frank oversaw management of the company's duties, which included paying his staff and rostering. Jim Conley. Conley was an African-American man who worked as a sweeper at the pencil factory. Conley was held as an accomplice to the murder of Mary. His testimony proved crucial in finding Frank guilty. He testified that Frank told him on the day of the murder that a girl was going to come by for a chat and to watch out, and that Conley should lock the front door and keep it locked until someone whistled. Since the case, the ADL have tried to put Mary's murder on Conley. Conley also admitted during the trial that he wrote the death notes found by Mary's body. I'll explain what these are later. Newt Lee. Lee was the African-American watchman at the factory who discovered Mary's body and called the police. He was the first one held on suspicion of the murder, and there was an attempt to seemingly frame Lee for the murder at first, due to the bloody shirt found at his residence, which was later held to be a plant, as well as the death notes attributing the murder to the Night Witch. Again, I'll explain this as we go on. John Milton Gant. Gant was another suspect known to be good friends with Mary. Gant was the former paymaster at the firm who Leo Frank had fired 3 weeks earlier due to the payroll being short $1. Thomas Felder. Felder was an attorney believed to be a supporter of Frank. He claimed to represent Mary's family and friends, however Mary's stepfather was greatly angered by this claim. Alonzo Mann. Mann worked at the pencil company as a 13-year-old at the time of Mary's murder. He testified that he'd left the office before it was believed Mary was murdered. He would later sensationally retract his testimony in 1982, which I'll discuss later. Mann's updated story is one of the linchpins of the ADL's defense of Frank to this day. Montine Stover. Stover was a 14-year-old child who worked at the National Pencil Company, who visited the office in around the time it was believed Mary was murdered. In the spring of 1913, Mary took a job with the National Pencil Company, where she earned 10 cents an hour operating a knurling machine that inserted rubber erasers into the metal tips of pencils. She worked 55 hours per week. She worked across the hallway from Leo Frank's office. Interesting that Frank would initially say that he'd no idea who Mary was. On April 21, 1913, Phagan was laid off due to a material shortage. Around noon, April 26th, she went to the factory to claim her pay. The next day, shortly before 3 a.m, the factory's night watchman, Newt Lee, went to the factory basement to use the toilet. After leaving the toilet, Lee discovered Phagan's body in the rear of the basement, near an incinerator, and called the police. Mary's face was blackened and scratched, and her head was bruised and battered. There were also very obvious signs that she had been raped by her murderer. 2 notes were found in a pile of rubbish by Phagan's head and became known as the Death Notes. The Death Notes made reference to someone called the Night Witch. The Night Witch was thought to mean night watch, the position that Newt Lee, the man who found Mary's body, held at the time. When the notes were initially read aloud, Lee said, "Boss, it looks like they're trying to lay it on me." Lee was arrested that morning based on these notes and his apparent familiarity with the body. The trial that would eventually take place, headed up by prosecutor Hugh Dorsey, would eventually find Leo Frank guilty of Mary's murder and rape and sentence Frank to the death penalty. His sentence was later commuted to life in prison, whereby the citizens of Atlanta were enraged, kidnapped Frank and lynched him on a tree. This would spark the formation of the ADL. I will now read the following excerpt from Bradford Huey's in-depth analysis of the case. This analysis, as well as the sources on the website littlemaryphagan.com, are thorough, excellent, and basically deal with every small detail from the case. Every peculiarity and party is dealt with in Huey's analysis, unlike what is found on the ADL's website and contemporary articles protesting Frank's innocence. The website littlemaryphagan.com is so confident in its position that it links various sources in defense of Frank, even including a link to the ADL's website, so that the reader may have all possible information before arriving at their conclusion. Analysis in support of Frank's guilt. Only Leo Frank had the opportunity to be alone with Mary Phagan, and he admits he was alone with her in his office when she came to get her pay. And in fact, he was completely alone with her on the second floor. Had Jim Connolly been the killer, he would have had to attack her practically at night at the entrance of the building, where he sat almost all day, where people were constantly coming and going, and where several witnesses noticed Connolly, with no assurance of even a moment of privacy. Leo Frank had told Newt Lee, the pencil factory's night watchman, to come earlier than usual at 4 p.m. on the day of the murder, but Frank was extremely nervous when Lee arrived, and insisted that Lee leave and come back in 2 hours. When Lee then suggested he could sleep for a couple of hours on the premises, and that there was a cot in the basement near the place where Lee would ultimately find the body, Frank refused to let him. Lee could have also slept in the packing room adjacent to Leo Frank's office, but Frank insisted Lee leave and have a good time. This violated the corporate rule that once the night watchman entered the building, he could not leave until he handed over the keys to the day watchman. Newt Lee, though strongly suspected at first, was manifestly innocent and had no reason to lie, and had good relations with Frank and no motive to hurt him. When police finally reached Frank after the body of Mary Phagan had been found, Frank emphatically denied knowing the murdered girl by name, even though he'd probably seen her hundreds of times. He had to pass by her at the workstation where she'd worked for a year, every time he inspected the workers' area on the second floor, and every time he went to the bathroom. And as he filled out her payslip personally on approximately 52 occasions, marking it with the initials MP. Witnesses also testified that Frank had spoken to Mary Phagan on multiple times, even getting a little too close for comfort at times, putting his hand on her shoulder and calling her by Mary. When police accompanied Frank to the factory on the morning after the murder, Frank was so nervous and shaking so badly he could not even perform simple tasks like unlocking the door. Early in the investigation, Leo Frank told police that he knew that J.M. Gant had been intimate with Mary Phagan, immediately making Gant a suspect. Gant was arrested and interrogated, but how could Frank have known such a thing about a girl he didn't even know by name, supposedly? Also early in the investigation, while both Leo Frank and Newt Lee were being held and some suspicion was still directed at Lee, a bloody shirt was found in a barrel at Lee's home. Investigators became suspicious when it was proved that the blood marks on the shirt had been made by wiping it. The shirt had no trace of body odour, and the blood had fully soaked even the armpit area, even though only a small quantity of blood was found at the crime scene. This was the first sign that money was being used to procure illegal acts and interfere with the case, and as such direct suspicion away from Leo Frank. Leo Frank claimed that he was in the office continuously from noon to 12:35 on the day of the murder, but a witness friendly to Frank, 14-year-old Montine Stover, said Frank's office was totally empty from 12:05 to 12:10 while she waited for him before giving up and leaving. This was approximately the same time as Mary Phagan's visit to Frank's office and the time she was murdered. On Sunday, April 27, 1913, Frank told police that Mary Phagan came into his office at 12:03. The next day, Frank made a deposition to the police with his lawyers present, in which he said he was alone with Mary Phagan in his office between 12:05 and 12:10, the same time Montine Stover said he'd been missing. Frank would later change his story again, stating on the stand that Mary Phagan came into his office a full 5 minutes later. Leo Frank contradicted his own testimony when he finally admitted on the stand that he had possibly unconsciously gone to the metal room between 12:05 and 12:10 on the day of the murder. The metal room, which Frank finally admitted at trial he might have unconsciously visited at the approximate time of the killing, was the room in which the prosecution said the murder occurred. It was also where investigators found spots of blood and some blondish hair twisted on a lathe handle. Although at the start of the trial many believed the murder was committed by Newt Lee, it was soon held that the discovery of the bloody shirt of his home was indeed planted. Along with other factors such as Lee's unshakable testimony, public opinion would soon begin to change. One of the clues provided by Frank against Newt Lee was that Lee had not punched the company's time clock properly, evidently missing several of his rounds and giving time in which to kill Mary Phagan and return home to hide the bloody shirt. But that directly contradicted Frank's initial statement the morning after the murder that Lee's time slip was complete and proper in every way. Why the change? The attempt to frame Lee would eventually crumble, especially after it was discovered that Mary died soon after noon, 4 hours before Lee's first arrival at the factory. Almost immediately after the murder, pro-Frank partisans hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to investigate the crime. But even the Pinkertons being paid by Frank's supporters eventually were forced to come to the conclusion that Frank was the guilty man. Jim Conley, the janitor, stated that Leo Frank sometimes employed him to watch the entrance at the factory while Frank chatted with teenage girl employees upstairs. Conley said that Frank admitted that he had accidentally killed Mary Phagan when she resisted his advances and sought help in hiding the body and in writing the black dialect death notes that attempted to throw suspicion on the night watchman. Conley said he was supposed to come back later to burn Mary's body in return for $200, but fell asleep and did not return. Several young women and girls testified at the inquest that Frank had made improper advances towards them. In one instance, touching a girl's breast, and another appearing to offer money for compliance with his desires. The Atlanta Georgian reported, girls and women were called to the stand to testify that they'd been employed at the factory or had occasion to go there, and that Frank had attempted familiarities with them. Nellie Pettis of 9 Oliver Street declared that Frank had made improper advances towards her. She was asked if she had ever been employed at the pencil factory. She said no. Do you know who Leo Frank is? I've seen him once or twice. When and when did you see him? In his office at the factory whenever I went to draw my sister-in-law's pay. What did he say to you on that night that might have been improper? He didn't exactly say. He made gestures. I went to get the girl's pay about 4 weeks ago, and when I went to the office of Mr. Frank, I asked for her. He told me I couldn't see her unless I saw him first. I told him I didn't want to see him. He pulled a box from his desk. It had a lot of money in it. He looked at it significantly and then looked at me. When he looked at me, he winked. As he winked, he said, "How about it?" I instantly told him I was a nice girl. Here the witness stopped her statement. Another young girl, Nellie Wood, testified stating that Frank had touched her breasts and when his advances were rejected, stated that he was joking. In May of 1913, attorney Thomas Felder made his loud but mysterious appearance. Colonel Felder, as he was known, was soliciting donations to bring yet another private detective agency into the case. Pinkerton's great rival, the William Burns Agency. Felder claimed to be representing neighbours, friends and family members of Mary Phagan, but Mary's stepfather, J.W. Coleman, was so angered by this misrepresentation that he made an affidavit denying there was any connection between him and Felder. It was widely believed that Felder and Burns were secretly retained by Frank's supporters. The most logical interpretation of these events is that having largely failed in getting the Pinkerton agency to perform corrupt acts on behalf of Frank, Frank's supporters decided to covertly bring in another, and hopefully more cooperative agency in the case. When Jim Conley finally admitted he wrote the death notes found near Mary Phagan's body, Leo Frank's reaction was powerful. Quote, according to James Conley, Frank looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. His hands moved nervously around his face, and his face twitched, but he absolutely declined to deny the truth of the black sweeper's statement or make any comment of the sort upon it. His only answer to the repeated questions that were shot at him was a negative shaking of the head or the simple, "I have nothing to say." Atlanta, Georgia, May 26th. May 24, 1913, after hearing evidence from prosecutor Hugh Dorsey and his witnesses, the grand jury charged Leo Frank with the murder of Mary Phagan. 4 Jews were on the grand jury of 21 persons. Although only 12 votes were needed, the vote was unanimous against Frank. A historian specialising in the history of anti-Semitism, Albert Lindemann, denies that prejudice against Jews was a factor and states that the jurors were persuaded by the concrete evidence that Dorsey presented. And this indictment was handed down even without the hearing of Jim Conley's testimony, which had yet to come out. On August 25, 1913, after more than 29 days of the longest and most costly trial in Southern history up to that point, and after 2 of the South's most talented and expensive attorneys and a veritable army of detectives and agents in their employ gave their all in defence of Leo Frank, and after 4 hours of jury deliberation, Frank was unanimously convicted of the murder of Mary Phagan. The trial judge, Leonard Strickland Rowan, had the power to set aside the guilty verdict of Frank if he believed that the defendant had not received a fair trial. He did not do so, effectively making the vote 13-0. Judge Rowan also had the power to sentence Frank to a lesser sentence of life imprisonment, and on October 31st, 1913, the court rejected a request for a new trial by the Frank defence team and resentenced Frank to die. The sentence handed down by Judge Benjamin Hill was set to be carried out on Frank's 30th birthday, April 17th, 1914. Supported by a huge fundraising campaign launched by the American Jewish community, and supported by a public relations campaign carried out by innumerable newspapers and publishing companies, Leo Frank continued to mount a prodigious defence even after his conviction, employing some of the most prominent lawyers in the US. Frank's new team filed a long series of appeals to every possible level of the US court system, beginning with an application to the Georgia Superior Court. That court rejected Frank's appeal as groundless. The next appeal by Frank's so-called dream team of world-renowned attorneys was to the Georgia Supreme Court. It was rejected. A second appeal was then made by Frank's lawyers to the Georgian Supreme Court, which was also rejected as groundless. The next appeal by Frank's phalanx of attorneys was to the US Federal District Court, which also found Frank's arguments unpersuasive and turned down the appeal, affirming the guilty verdict. Next, the Frank legal team appealed to the highest court in the land, the US Supreme Court, which rejected Frank's arguments and turned down his appeal. Moving on to 1982, Alonzo Mann, who in 1913 had been 13 years old and employed as an office boy for the National Pencil Company, made a sensation in the press by denying the sworn testimony he had previously made at Leo Frank's trial, and stating that in his belief, Jim Conley was the real killer of Mary Phagan. In 1913, Mann had testified that he left the office on the day of the murder at 11:30 a.m. In 1982, he changed the time and told quite a different story. Mann said they returned to work that day, and when he entered the building, he said he saw Jim Conley carrying the limp body of a girl on the first floor. Quote, "He wheeled on me in a voice that was low but threatening, and he said, 'If you ever mention this, I'll kill you.'" Mann claims he then left the building and ran home, telling his mother what he'd seen. Mann says that his parents advised him to keep silent and avoid publicity. There are several problems with Mann's story. Why would a 13-year-old Alonzo Mann return to work on a holiday if he didn't have to? And why return to work if apparently he wasn't even scheduled to do so? Were office boys permitted to make their own hours in 1913? When other workers, such as Mary Phagan for example, hadn't sufficient supplies in their department, they were immediately laid off until supplies came back in. Surely such an economy would dictate that office boys would only come in when authorised to do so. If Alonzo Mann had such a definite appointment to meet his mother in town, so definite as to cause him to return to work just minutes after he failed to immediately find her, why then was she waiting at home just minutes after that? Why would white parents like Alonzo Mann's in the racially conscious and segregated Atlanta, Georgia of 1913 tell their white son not to tell the police about a guilty black murderer, when the result of not telling the police would ultimately result in the death of an innocent, clean-cut white man like Leo Frank, the man who gave their son a highly prized job, going to the gallows as an innocent man? And why would Alonzo Mann's parents then allow their 13-year-old son to report to work at the National Pencil Company on Monday morning, April 28, 1913, 2 days after he was threatened with the death by a murderer carrying a dead or dying white girl on his shoulders, knowing that the murder would still be there and knowing that there were many dark and secluded places in which their son might come to harm? Jim Conley reported back to work that Monday, as did Alonzo Mann. If Alonzo Mann really walked in on Jim Conley carrying Mary Phagan's body a few minutes after noon and then turned around and left the building, why didn't he see Montine Stover? If Jim Conley really attacked Mary Phagan at the foot of the stairs, as Alonzo Mann suggests, why didn't Leo Frank hear her scream or any sounds of a struggle? He was only 40 feet away. Several witnesses for both the prosecution and the defence testified that they saw Jim Conley sitting, doing nothing, in the dark recesses of the lobby of the National Pencil Company on the morning of the murder. Which story does this fit more? The contention of the prosecution that Frank requested Conley's presence on that day, as he had on others, so Conley could be a lookout while Frank was chatting with a teenage girl? Or does it make more sense to believe that Conley really believed he could get away with loafing around on company property without permission all morning? Did black janitors in 1913 have the right to make their own working hours, even on a holiday where there would have been little call for their services? Does it really make sense that the somewhat literate and fairly intelligent Jim Conley, a black man in the extremely conscious and white-dominated Atlanta of 1913, where lynch law often reigned supreme, actually thought he could get away with attacking and killing a white girl just a few feet away from the unlocked door of the factory where he worked, in the highest traffic area of the building? The relationship of Leo Frank and the National Pencil Company to Jim Conley was a strange one also. Why was Conley's sweeper salary much higher, $6 versus $4, than the average white employee, many of whom were skilled machine operators? Could it be that Conley served a very important but secret purpose for Leo Frank, exactly as the prosecution alleged? Could he have had knowledge that could potentially hurt Leo Frank, justifying Frank giving him special privileges? For example, Conley was once caught urinating on the pencils but was never fired by Frank. Conley was also not required to punch in on time. In 1983, the ADL, along with other Jewish groups, spearheaded a campaign to get the Georgia State Board of Pardon and Paroles to issue a posthumous pardon to Leo Frank, basing their case largely on the 1982 statement of Alonzo Mann. The board found that Mann's statement added no new evidence to the case. Frank's wife, Lucille, died in 1957, and in her will she specifically directed that she be cremated and thus not buried next to or with her first and only husband, Leo, even though a plot had already been provided for her next to him. Leonard Dinnerstein is an author who made his almost entire career writing about anti-Semitism, with a special concentration on proving that Leo Frank was a victim of anti-Semitism. His book, The Leo Frank Case, is promoted as a canonical work and is one of the main sources for the claims that anti-Semitism was pervasive in 1913 Georgia, and that anti-Semitism was the major factor in the prosecution of Leo Frank. Both of these claims are hoaxes, as shown by Elliot Dashfield's writing in the American Mercury. Quotes, Dinnerstein makes his now famous claim that mobs of anti-Semitic Southerners outside the courtroom which Frank was on trial were shouting into the open, "Crack the Jew's neck, lynch him," and that members of the crowd were making open death threats against the jury, saying that the jurors would be lynched if they didn't vote to hang the damn Sheeny. But not one of the three major Atlanta newspapers, who had teams of journalists documenting feint by feint all events in the courtroom, large and small, and who also had a team of reporters with the crowds outside, ever reported of these alleged vociferous threats. And certainly such a newsworthy event could not be ignored by the highly competitive newsmen eager to sell papers and advance their careers. During the 2 years of Leo Frank's appeals, none of these alleged anti-Semitic death threats were ever reported by Frank's own defense team. There is not a word of them in the 3,000 pages of official Leo Frank trial and appeal record. Yet thanks to Leonard Dinnerstein, this fictional episode has entered the consciousness of Americans of all stations as history, as one of the pivotal facts of the Frank case. Far from being a region rife with hatred for Jews, the South in general and Atlanta in particular were regarded by Jews as a haven and place nearly free of anti-Semitism they suffered in other parts of the country. Even today, and even after Jewish-Gentile relations were strained by the Frank case and by the Jewish support for civil rights revolution, the Christians who form most of the population of the South are stoutly pro-Jewish. Writer Aaron Scott gives insight into the Southern attitude towards Jews when he says, in the race-conscious South of 1913, Jews were considered white. In fact, in the newspapers of Atlanta, before, during and after the trial of Leo Frank for the murder of Mary Phagan, Frank was referred to as a white man. Aaron also cites a study funded and published by a Jewish group, John Higman in his Social Discrimination Against Jews 1830 to 1930, a work commissioned by the American Jewish community called the South, historically the section least inclined to ostracize Jews. Jewish-Gentile relations had somewhat declined by the mid-20th century due to the massive campaign by Frank's appeals to paint the prosecution and the South generally as anti-Semitic, and the eventual creation of the ADL in the wake of Frank's death played their part in this change. All things considered, the South in general and Atlanta in particular seem to have been, if anything, a safe haven for Jews. Southern attitudes towards Jews can be further gauged by the fact that during the Civil War, Southerners made a Jew their Secretary of the Treasury. Judah P. Benjamin was the first Jewish appointee to any cabinet position in a North American government. Benjamin was so highly regarded that his portrait graced the paper money of the South. The claim that a pervasive and vicious anti-Semitism was the real reason for the prosecution and conviction of Leo Frank is an absurd lie and a fantastic misrepresentation of history. It is also highly unlikely that prosecutor Hugh Dorsey was motivated by anti-Semitism in his prosecution of Frank, considering that a partner in his law firm was Jewish. It is preposterous to even have to ask the question, but if Dorsey hated Jews enough to send one to the gallows as an innocent man, why would he tolerate and proudly claim as he did at trial such a close association with a Jewish man? Why did the Leo Frank defense team, consisting of some of the most skilled attorneys in the state, refuse to cross-examine 20 young women and girls who testified that Frank had bad moral character? Mary Phagan's grandniece, Mary Phagan Keene, relates in her book, The Murder of Little Mary Phagan, that her grandfather, William Joshua Phagan, confronted Jim Connolly in private in 1934 and was ultimately convinced that the former factory sweeper was telling the truth. At times so emotionally moved that he could barely hold back tears, William Phagan finally told Connolly that he believed him, and said if he thought he was lying, quotes, "I'd kill you myself." After the intense meeting was over, Jim Connolly and Mary Phagan's brother went out for a drink. As I stated at the start of this video, if I believed that the evidence was not conclusive, weighed even slightly towards Connolly committing the murder, or there was just some uncertainty as to whether Frank committed the murder, I would not have made this video, as I believe going all in on a verdict that I'm not positive on just to make a political point against the ADL would be to do a disservice to the memory of Mary Phagan. This was a girl whose life was brutally cut short, and the ADL are trying and succeeding to rewrite history and rob Mary and her family of justice. It should be obvious to anyone who interacts with the vast amount of sources available in this case that Frank was guilty of this crime. I fully believe many members of the ADL know this too, but truth is secondary to them. Below advocating for their interests, even if it comes at the expense of someone like Mary. This organisation now wields immense power to shape global discourse and must be stopped.